All right, we will go ahead and get started. We are recording this webinar. It will be available on our website for people to view in its entirety or in pieces, whatever you prefer. But I wanted to welcome everyone here today. My name is Joel White. I'm the Executive Director of the Health Innovation Alliance. HIA is an organization that was founded 14 years ago to advocate for policies that advance technology and data to make healthcare work better. We've got about 50 different members. They're from all different aspects of the healthcare system. Our biggest cohort, though, are patient organizations, because they believe that getting the technology and the data done right will mean their healthcare works better for them. And that's really important. And so I wanted to welcome everyone here today, especially our esteemed panel and our moderator. We are here to talk about the role of innovation and technology in the fight against COVID-19. I can't think of a better topic to talk about, and I can't think of a better group of panelists to join us in discussing some of these issues. Again, I'm Joel White. I'm the Executive Director. I'm just going to kind of kick things off here a little bit and then turn it over to Jay to introduce the panelists and get into the meat of the matter. But I think first and foremost, thank you for joining us. Secondly, I think to say that COVID was a major shakeup of ingrained practice patterns and how we did the way of doing business normally would be an understatement. And I think it presented massive challenges, obviously, but it also created incredible opportunities. And the thing I take away from COVID is that we stepped up. We used creativity and we used our ingenuity, and we put our shoulders to the grindstone and really produced some innovations that are, I think, going to change healthcare into the future, not just for the pandemic. And so, first and foremost, I think we had the biopharmaceutical manufacturers step up and really focus in on vaccines and biopharmaceutical products and diagnostic tools to be able to really crush the virus. And I think we put incentives on the table, but we also waived some program rules and regulations that were getting in the way of innovation. And what ended up was vaccines that came into the market in a record period of time. It was absolutely astonishing what innovation was able to produce. And I know we're going to get into those issues here in a bit, but we also had to do testing. We needed to know who was infected and who wasn't infected. We needed to know now who's received a vaccine or who hasn't. And we need to be able to safely reopen in the economy, in our schools, and in our society. And all of that is going to be made possible through data and through technology, but most importantly through innovation. So I'm really excited about what the panel is going to talk about today. And hopefully we'll bring it all around to how we can make things better into the future through additional creativity, ingenuity, innovation, and change government policies so that we can make healthcare work better for people. So thank you for joining us today. And Dr. Bott, I'm really happy you're with us today. It's awesome that you've agreed to moderate this panel. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Joel. And just what a tremendous honor to be part of this community and this esteemed panel. Joel, appreciate your leadership in the work that you're doing with the Health Innovation Alliance. I know, that one of the important things that has come forward in this pandemic is the power and the opportunity that comes to bear when you bring stakeholders together around a purpose and mission. And so thanks for all that you do. And we just have quite a treat for all of you, just an incredibly experienced panel that has served in crisis, in times of driving the future, and really has made a difference across the sector for our country. And so I'll just do a brief introduction, make some opening comments, and then turn it over to the panel for them to share some of their insights and the background, of their organization work. And so today we're joined by Dr. James Main, and he's Vice President, Science and Regulatory Advocacy at Pharma, where he provides leadership for pharma's involvement in a number of science-based public-private partnerships and works to support the industry's efforts to drive a contemporary R&D ecosystem and drug development pathways. And so, Jim, appreciate you joining us today. And then we have Chris Moose from IBM. He's a partner at IBM's Healthcare and Life Sciences practice, developing new pharmaceutical distribution strategies with federal, state, and city and commercial entities and talk about those partnerships. This includes looking at COVID-19 supply chain, as well as enabling safe and rapid vaccine adoption. So thanks so much, Chris, for being with us today. And then we have Dr. Lee Payne, the lead for the Department of Defense Coronavirus Task Force Diagnostics and Testing Line of Effort. Now, Dr. Payne has had a decorated and significant career in the Department of Defense and in the military, working in a number of different areas, including with Operation Warp Speed, with Coronavirus Task Force, and helped shape some of the work of the Defense Health Agency moving forward. And then we have Dr. Tara O'Toole, who is Executive Vice President and Senior Fellow in QTEL, who will discuss some of the roles biotechnologies that can help detect, manage, and quench the epidemics of infectious disease. And she's had a tremendous career in government and in the public sector, private sector. She, prior to joining IQTEL, served as the Undersecretary for Science and Technology at the Department of Homeland Security and was active in the bull epidemic and served as Assistant Secretary of Energy for Environment, Safety, and Health. And so we're glad to have you with us, Tara, as well. And then we have Mike Popovich from STC Health, who founded the Scientific Technologies Corporation in 1980 and currently serves as Chief Executive Officer. And, it's an information technology company providing solutions to local governments, but evolved to play an important role in the public health sphere and bringing, as all of our panelists have in their roles, important capabilities to bear on the crisis of this pandemic and the challenge for positive transformation that Mill created. So we're really please join me in welcoming them and their leadership to this conversation. So, what I would say is that COVID was and is a major shakeup of longstanding ingrained practice patterns. And it's the default setting that we're trying to move to a place of, in discomfort. How do you grow in those moments? And rather than retreat to that is comfortable, identify opportunities to move forward. We responded collectively with creativity that produced innovation. I think innovation was aided and abetted by changes in program rules and incentives that included regulatory flexibility and encouragement through funding, but not always that. I think what we also saw was really unique partnerships because of people from different areas coming to mission. I mean, whether it was manufacturing companies around PPE or whether it was logistics and it was data and technology. That was not just healthcare data and tech, but other industries. And I think we've seen the incredible opportunity that biopharma and biotech has played in both treatments and vaccines. And I think, many would agree that this has produced the greatest public health, public policy, and clinical response in the history of the world. And so we're going to be hearing about some of the ways that these challenges were addressed from our experts and today. And I think the other thing is that these are opportunities to learn lessons, not to go back to the pre-pandemic way of doing things, particularly if it stifles innovation, progress clinically, and moving forward in a way that we can be better and drive a new standard for how we might do public-private partnerships, how we drive development of treatments and vaccination, how partners can come together in interesting ways to meet the need. And to the point that Joel made about patients, I think what also we've seen is that the voice of people illuminated, voice of communities, the inequities, illuminated in ways that are very clear to people because this affects everyone. And COVID-19 has been something that we all have been impacted by across the world. And so I think back to Everett M. Rogers and diffusion theory, and this notion of that there's innovators, early adopters, the early majority, late majority, and laggards. And when we think about what COVID-19 has driven, it's the questions that arise are: what's the intervention's perceived advantage or benefit or product? What's the risk associated with moving in a particular direction with a product? What's the ease of use or complexity? What are the benefits that immediately in the short term, but then also in the long term, and what behavior change required to make things work, and then what's the process flow and the return on investment? And I think that we have seen in the midst of challenges, the unintended positive consequences as well on the climate, on other infectious diseases like flu that are not in the area, but also, I think, opportunities in ways we can move forward. So with that, let me turn this over to start with Dr. Main with pharma, and we'll kick it off with you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bott. I'd like to just give a little bit of background on who I am and where I come from, and then talk a little bit about how pharma as an organization and the biopharmaceutical industry as an industry have really responded to this crisis in this time. I'm the Vice President of Science Advocacy at pharma. I have a wonderfully fascinating job that allows me to do things like this conference, and I certainly want to thank the organizers for the opportunity to speak with everyone today. But it also puts me in close proximity with the leaders of research and development of 30 or so of the largest pharmaceutical companies on the planet. And to give a little perspective, on January 12th of last year, which was the day after the Chinese first released the sequence of the coronavirus to scientists, on the 12th of January last year, we were meeting as a group with these heads of research and development, and the question on the table was, what's going to be our response? How are we going to engage this threat? And at that point in time, it was a localized outbreak in China, as you'll recall. And to a person, the response was oftentimes with a fist banging off the table was, we need to get out in front of this. We need to bring the full collective resources of our industry to bear. So they got the gravity of the situation both instantly and early, and that's a story of what went on within the industry very early last year. From that point forward, we all saw in real time, and in a way that gave a transparency into how the industry works that has never really been seen before. We all got to see innovation in the real world and in real time. I like to think of the innovation that we saw last year as coming in a number of waves. And those waves included this initial evaluation of the disease. What is the sequence of the virus? What does the virus do? What are the consequences of infection and the disease associated with the virus? And using that information to identify druggable targets. This was going on in January of last year. And in fact, within 72 hours of the disclosure of the sequence of the virus, there were prototypical vaccines designed. Let's let that sink in within 72 hours. The next wave was really rapid prototyping of these vaccine candidates. So bringing them out of the theoretical and into being. So they were designed, they were synthesized, and they were characterized. The third wave, as I like to describe it, was rapid portfolio screening. So not only were we going after vaccines on the preventive side, but we're also looking for treatments and therapies. And the first place we looked was in the existing portfolios. So using those druggable targets that were identified from characterizing disease, dozens of companies working in partnership, and I want to emphasize the partnership part of this on several points here, work to identify molecules that potentially could be used in the early going. This is where we got remdesivir, baricitinib, and some of the tools that are still in use today. The fourth wave, the development of these not perfect quite yet, but purpose-designed molecules that were designed and created specifically for the purpose of addressing COVID. And the signature examples of these are the antibodies that have received emergency use authorization. The fifth wave of the development and manufacturing at incredible scale of these vaccines. The development, each program was a clinical program of over 40,000 participants, massive scale. Each manufacturing campaign was measuring batch yields in the millions. The vaccines that are being given today from Pfizer, for example, are vaccines that began their development cycle roughly the time of Halloween last year or Thanksgiving. So it's taken that long for those vaccines to go from their very first production step all the way to the marketplace. And that's how early those companies were working on not supplies for clinical studies, but supplies for the marketplace at risk. The next wave is, of course, the regulatory review and the partnership, really the dialogue, the collaboration with regulators to make sure that we are able to move as quickly as possible. And then the wave that we're seeing right now, which I would characterize as the current and the future, is these next generation products. We're already talking about and beginning the design process for vaccine variants to address the risk of variants, boosters, and so on. We're talking about more targeted antivirals that will work in this space as both therapeutic and preventive products. And we're beginning now to get into the space where we're getting out ahead of the vaccine and the infection, even while the products are rolling out. So I offer that as sort of a timeline of innovation and the waves of innovation that we've seen. All that existed because the industry had tremendous partnership with the federal government, with regulators, with academic researchers, and because we had a running head start. We had the technology platforms in place, we had the experience in hand, and we had the expertise in-house to pull this off.
Thank you so much, Dr. Main. I think you ended perfectly in sort of the characteristics and components that needed to come together in order to make the kinds of impact and innovation that we've seen. And so now I'll go to retired Major General Dr. Lee Payne to talk to us about your experience. And again, thank you for your contribution to service.
Well, thank you all. It's a great pleasure to join you this afternoon. I'm going to speak about the department's COVID-19 testing and diagnostic efforts. Now, we're about to experience some winter storms here in DC and across the country. So I put up my spring background with the cherry blossoms to give us all a little hope, despite what happened with the groundhog on February 2nd. So I want to give you a brief overview today about how we've approached COVID-19 testing since the beginning of the pandemic. What we've been able to achieve in expanding our testing and diagnostic capabilities, and how we've innovated to improve that ability to protect our missions and our force. And then I'd like to highlight three specific areas of innovation that have helped us meet our pandemic testing demands. Since April, I've been leading the diagnostic and testing line of effort for the DoD COVID Task Force. And our mission is to synchronize DoD testing across the entire department. We direct all the network of clinical, public health, and research laboratories that conduct diagnostic, screening, and surveillance testing requirements for the department. We use testing as part of a larger risk mitigation strategies to maintain operations and to secure national defense. We centrally manage our constrained supplies. We've integrated and piloted emerging technologies and incorporated those into our testing strategies. And really importantly, we provided a single point of contact to coordinate with our interagency partners, CDC, HHS, the Food and Drug Administration, and others, as we try to coordinate a national response. And then we've attempted to standardize our best practices across the department. So how have we done? Since the pandemic started, we've made some significant progress for the department. We've completed over 2.5 million clinical diagnostic screening and surveillance tests on our DoD beneficiary population. We've been able to double the number of DoD labs conducting COVID testing, and increased our weekly testing execution from about 10,000 tests per week in April that was largely diagnostic testing to about 70 to 100,000 tests per week today. We've increased our testing inventory, which was about 60,000 tests in April, to over 2 million tests today, and expanded the test methods and the laboratory-based molecular tests in April to a much broader, diverse portfolio, including rapid point-of-care PCR tests, antigen tests, oral saliva tests, research use only tests, and I'll talk about that in one of our innovations, pooled sample testing, next generation sequencing, and then obviously tests that are conducted by our commercial lab partners. So one example of our innovations is testing algorithms that we developed for improving broader test adoption. In the summer of 2020, supplies started, basically our burn rate was exceeding our resupply because of the second wave of the pandemic. So we began adding additional testing technologies to our toolkit. The point of care PCR tests, rapid antigen tests, and oral saliva tests. But the interesting thing is, as we've all experienced, the adoption at the front lines is not always immediate. So trying to get folks to understand which technologies to use, what was the right test to use and the right for the patient, and then as a side effect of that, how did that help us conserve molecular and PCR tests? So we basically used CDC guidance, FDA guidance to develop those frontline clinician protocols to help them pick the right test at the right time for the patient-specific circumstances, and that's really helped us. An example is we use serial antigen testing for those that are living in congregate living settings. That's really helped us preserve some of our molecular test resources. Pool testing, our public health laboratories using research use only test is the second one I wanted to highlight. Again, in 2020, we were looking for ways to really stretch our supplies, and we decided to implement some pool testing strategies. So what we were able to do, led by our Army colleagues, they were able to validate surveillance testing in our DoD public health laboratories using research use only tests. And then we transfer those samples for the positive pools to a CLIA certified laboratory to conduct diagnostic testing to find those individuals, to isolate them and treat them who might be transmitting the disease. We've established a pool testing working group, and the Army is leading our efforts to share those best practices and expand that capability to the other services. And we hope that that's going to give us up to about 80,000 tests per week in the coming weeks and months. And additionally, we've adopted pool diagnostic testing, and we've successfully worked with some of the manufacturers to obtain FDA approval for pool testing for some of their tests. And maybe one of the most exciting technologies is next generation sequencing. The United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Disease, or USAMRIID, came to us several months ago and said, with a research idea, that they could use next-gen sequencing to conduct basically sort of pooling on a grand scale. And we funded that research for them. It's basically using the genetic sequencing technology and standard PCR testing to conduct several thousand tests per run. It conserves testing supplies, and it provides tests at a much lower cost. We've operationalized this at USAMRIID, and we expect right now that will increase testing about 10,000 tests per week for us. We're going to leverage that with USAMRIID to use that as a model to spread that to other research laboratories across the department. We're also exploring with USAMRIID the possibility of getting an emergency use authorization from the FDA to use this as a diagnostic test, and we could spread that across the department as well. This technology can also provide viral genomic sequencing for variant identification, and we believe that this type of technology is the kind of thing that we need to leave behind and have as a nascent technology for the department so that we have better future pandemic preparedness. So let me say, we're gratified in closing. We're gratified to see the cases decline across the country, but we are not letting our guard down. This virus has a vote in how the future is going to play out, and we're going to continue to innovate, expand our technologies, and make sure that we can conduct the department's missions. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Major General. Appreciate those points. And I think the thing to lift up here is how you get to scale with the technologies that you alluded to. So thank you for sharing that. Now I'll go to Dr. Tara O'Toole to share her perspective and work. So To you. To unmute.
12 months of Zoom and I still forget the microphone. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I am a physician by training, and I have spent most of my career going back and forth between academia and government. For 10 years, I had the privilege of being CEO of what is now the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security. I then was Undersecretary at Homeland Security for Science and Technology before coming to In-Q-Tel 6 years ago. In-Q-Tel is a nonprofit, non-governmental organization that was started by the CIA 20 years ago to better connect innovative companies, small startup companies, with the national security agencies of the federal government. Small companies are where most of the innovation is happening today, in all fields, really, and they have a hard time connecting to the big, slow-moving, bureaucratic federal government. IQT looks at about 1,000 companies a year, and we invest in about 50. And we invest not for profit, but to enhance the mission impact of our federal agency customers. What I've been doing at In-Q-Tel for the past 5 years or so, along with a small team of colleagues, is looking at the technologies that could help us detect, manage, and quench epidemics of infectious disease, whether natural or deliberate. We bundled the technologies that we were interested in into what we call a technology architecture that has 4 main parts. So to manage an epidemic, you have to first be able to detect, diagnose, and characterize the pathogen. Secondly, you have to protect those who are well. Thirdly, you have to treat the sick. And fourthly, you have to collect and analyze data so you know what's going on, so you have situational awareness at any particular moment, so you can figure out if your interventions are working or not, whether the epidemic is enlarging or coming under control. And thirdly, so you can learn as you go along, because pandemics, epidemics are slow-moving, long-lasting creatures. So you really need to build in a learning function to quench these outbreaks faster. I have to say that we were not surprised by any of the extensive innovation and successes in technology that we saw in response to COVID-19. The underlying R&D was there. We had spent 20 years getting ready for mRNA vaccines. There were tons of diagnostic technologies out there, many of them as yet unapproved by FDA and untested. And it was very clear that we were going to stress our hospital system and our supply chains, and very clear that we had a huge data problem, which we have to pay attention to, but I would suggest is not going to be easily solved. And I will come back to that. I have to say, I think the biopharmaceutical industry, the entire community was exemplary in jumping on this problem and innovating towards solutions. I think the degree of collaboration and data sharing, not to mention innovation, was pretty much extraordinary. And I think getting effective vaccines into people in 1 year will stand as a major milestone in the history of medicine. I also want to say that I have great respect for the civil servants at all levels of government who were trying to get us through this pandemic from the standpoint of their various organizations. I think there is much to repair in government. that we need to turn our attention to. I think government lacks knowledge of and access to some routine technologies that they ought to have in hand, most particularly IT technologies for collecting and analyzing data. And I think we need to pay attention to the talent pipeline coming in to the federal government in particular. I have three major comments to make. One is that this pandemic should finally make clear that biosecurity has got to be a top national security priority. And we need to expend the resources needed to take care of it as such. We have known this is coming. I have been talking about pandemics, discussing pandemics in the senior levels of the federal government for 20 years. For 20 years, we could have been much better prepared organizationally and technologically. So now is the time. As the COVID response demonstrates, we are in a biorevolution. The last 50 years of investment in basic research into how living organisms work is paying off. That's how we got these vaccines. We are understanding how to program life. And this biorevolution is going to be more transformative of the world, of our economy, of how we make stuff than the digital revolution before it was. And government has got to awaken to both the promises and the perils of this biorevolution. And one of the consequences of that awakening should be efforts to make much more robust, ongoing, and differently flavored partnerships with the private sector from whence this innovation is coming. There's not one formula for a good public-private partnership, but one beginning step is conversations without conflict. Congress in particular needs to understand better what the stakes are here and how the American economy and standing in the world is going to be affected, not just by how we approach pandemic preparedness in the future, but how we understand and use the power of biology. To that end, we need to build, I believe, a much firmer infrastructure for translating the basic bioresearch, much of which has been supported by the US government over the past decades, into useful products. We need a much more robust GenBank, for example, where we can store the genetic sequences that are being accrued in various private laboratories, both commercial laboratories and research laboratories. We need an organ bank. We need to upgrade a lot of our translational technology and budget keeping, frankly. We spent decades and billions of dollars translating basic physical science knowledge into products, mostly on behalf of defense and the military. We do not have DOE national laboratories or 100 DOD laboratories or 7 levels of budget lines for translating the life sciences. We have the pharmaceutical industry as our translator for the life sciences, and they came through. They came through in this instance, but the public expenditures should also reflect the importance of biology and biotech to the society as well. So we need to pay much more attention to building infrastructure as well as relationships. McKinsey has famously put out a report in June of 2020 that says that by 2030, 60% of the world's economy, of the physical inputs to the world's economy, will be made by biological processes. we have to understand how transformative our knowledge of biology and our capacity to program the code of life is going to be, and lean into it. I would finally say, back to our public health infrastructure, that we have seen the adverse consequences of having an inadequate data structure. And we have to attend to that in an urgent way. But we also, I think, have to take care not to rush into it and spend a lot of money, as we have in the past, on systems that are just not going to be operational in the real world. This is going to take a very thoughtful and I think iterative approach to building a robust public health data infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. O'Toole. Really appreciate those insights around biosecurity as a priority, bioevolution, the power of bio, and investing in translation to really accelerate the ability to prepare and deal with pandemics and other challenges we may face. So thank you. And now we'll go to Mike Popovich, who's president of STC Health, for his comments. Thank you.
That's great. I love being on panels where you learn a lot more than you ever thought you needed to know, and it's just wonderful. And so you know, I commend all my panelists for providing this insight and information. It's just pretty cool. And I want to kind of follow a little bit on what Dr. O'Toole kind of left us with, and that is the public health infrastructure. And so just real quick, I happen to be the CEO, probably not because I'm brilliant or anything, but maybe it's more by default, of a company that's been working in public health infrastructure for 33 years. And most notably, a significant portion of that has been in the vaccine preventable disease area and the systems that support that. So I thought today, what I wanted to do was kind of provide just a quick slice of how this infrastructure is working or not working, and where some of the challenges have been, and where maybe investment and growth opportunities are in the near future, by illustrating, you know, kind of what's happening out there as these COVID vaccines are being given, and the need for data and information to flow through this infrastructure occurs. So again, the concept here of this presentation, it's all about leadership and innovation and how to overcome these big public health challenges. But I wanted to take us back a little bit in history and kind of illustrate how the public health immunization infrastructure got up to where it was in March of 2020, when changes need to be made to begin to address the vaccines that were coming out. And 25 years ago or plus, and I'm sure many on this call and certainly those on the panel know this, but CDC provided leadership and began to suggest to states through this leadership and funding that it was really time to start putting together information systems to track immunization events, most notably for children and pediatricians. And so this was all launched in the early 1990s. And so literally for over 2.5 decades, there has been innovation and evolution of these public health systems, again, specifically around the vaccine preventable area. And they have evolved from the typical old days when you had PCs and local area networks to, and you dialed in, to then when the internet came out, to have on-premises servers in health departments, and folks moved into that. And a third generation of these systems are now beginning to evolve. And these are all based more on secure cloud, off-premise, and developing new architectures and designs. And so there's been a long evolution, and that's both good news and bad news. And the bad news, I think, the good news is there was a lot in place when this event occurred. But the bad news is that, you know, sometimes when you drive an old car, it's just not, you're just a little nervous about how far it's going to get you. And in the time of a pandemic, that creates some additional challenges. So there's a few things that really, I think, have been significant drivers in this infrastructure over the years. And I could go all the way back to bioterrorism, but I'm going to jump up to the last pandemic, which was H1N1 in 2009. And the most notable thing about that is when the public health folks began to recognize, I think in earnest, the value of partnering with pharmacy, because it was the pharmacists that were able to step up and provide the H1N1 vaccine, along with public health and the existing provider networks, but they really provided the capability to extend the outreach. And so two things occurred from our point of view is that we began to notice that pharmacies understood the value and the return of investment for having immunization programs, and public health began to understand that even more so that value, and most notably, that's where most people go for a lot of their prescriptions and clinical kinds of care and those sort of things, especially adults. So the adult immunization efforts in pharmacies over the last few years have been significant. The other kind of key event here was the Affordable Care Act, and that was mentioned earlier. And that really was a driver to accelerate electronic data exchange between EHRs and then, frankly, the pharmacy management systems and state public health to support compliance of these public health reporting events. And all this has been really in play for the last couple decades, but certainly since the previous pandemic. And these systems have been involved in every outbreak, from local measles and mumps to natural disasters like hurricanes. They have continued to operate, and investment and some innovation has been made in these areas, which has been a good thing, because this brings us up to where the heck were we in 2020 of March, and then what happened, what has been happening in these networks since then. And so I think the good news is that there was a lot of infrastructure. In fact, there's some 64 of these national immunization information systems in jurisdictions across the country, every state, the territories, and some major cities. And part of this infrastructure has included, 40 to 50,000 and more pharmacies connected electronically to these information systems. And if I get time, I'll show you a quick graphic of what that looks like. But there's been a lot of immunization data flowing from the provider community into these systems, and that's created a tremendous amount of data in these environments. In fact, if you think about patient immunization records that are consolidated in these systems began so long ago that many of the children are now adults. And with the adult pharmacy data flowing in there are if I were to go in and look at the registries that we can operate and look at, we will often see well over 95% of a state's population has a record in these systems. In fact, often it's like 110% because people move and the data hasn't really been cleaned and processed, but it is significant, and it's in fact been underutilized. So when the pandemic hit, one of the first things public health had to do was kind of figure out, are these immunization systems and these infrastructures ready to support whatever might be happening? And so they had to begin to address questions like, will there be a new vaccine? Everybody said yes. They didn't know what the manufacturer was. They didn't know if it would be a series or a single dose. They didn't know with series doses, there's reminder and forecasting processes that use ACIP schedules that traditionally work for all immunizations. Those would have to be upgraded. They had to worry about were there new cold storage requirements, so they would update the vaccine ordering and management systems that are bolted onto these registries that were typically used for the Vaccine for Children program. They had to begin to consider, like, how do we onboard more providers? Because in a pandemic, you need more people sticking folks in the arm. And notably, how are we going to deal with mass immunization events when we know that it's going to take a while for all the vaccines to get out there? So those were the questions that public health folks were challenged with. And they began to address what innovation and systems do I need to put in place between now and whenever the vaccine rolled out. And actually, it was a good thing because there was a lot to build on. And I think Dr. Atul made another good point. In a pandemic, it's just not the best time to develop a brand new system from scratch. You're well advised to have a plan B or a plan A that says, what can I use now? How do I fill those gaps? What's needed? And what's going to happen? And I think the big challenge with building new systems when existing systems exist is you don't really understand the workflow and all the nuances, and you don't understand kind of the pressures that are happening out there. But it's not bad to start down those processes. It's just have to be careful how quickly you roll into those. So when the vaccine rolled out, the Pfizer vaccine was first, obviously, on 12/14. we have a national network we're able to operate. Again, I'll show you that real quick here in a second. And so we could see that as vaccines began to be given across the country, they started to be reported through this national immunization network to these 64 jurisdictions across the country. And it has certainly exponentially increased rapidly over the last eight or 9 weeks since the vaccine has rolled out. And the good news with all this is that those public health registries actually, for the most part, had made the changes necessary to support not only the Pfizer vaccine and its 2-dose series, but the Moderna, and now they're ready for the Johnson & Johnson, and they've updated their forecasting and storage. They've made the changes necessary, applying innovation and new technology and techniques to build and essentially bolt on all the issues that were evolving out of this system. And just for the heck of it, since I've got a minute, this is a fun thing to look at. I'm going to share this screen, and I promise I won't make you look at it very long. If you can see that, here's what this is. This is from a dashboard that I'm fortunate to be able to have available. I can send this out if folks want to see it. Every box is a patient immunization record, and it's a full data stream and demographics and manufacturer lot number, et cetera, in that record. Every box is coming from a pharmacy or provider. This isn't the entire U.S., but it's about 60% of the country. If the box is flowing up, it is an immunization event being reported to one of the 64 jurisdictions. If that box is purple, it's a COVID shot that's being reported. And you can see a little flag, so you can kind of tell the state, and there's a code on there. You can actually tell the facility. If a box is flowing down, that is a patient event that a provider through their EHR or a clinical system or a pharmacy management system has a real-time query through these connections to public health, and it's bidirectional, and it's probably a forecast, and it's pulling down the consolidated patient record so that provider has insight into where that individual's gaps are. And there's I think it's pretty impressive, because just this small slice of this and this view, and if I were to turn on this music and there's a ding every time one of these are COVID boxes, you would think it's a new game you were playing. So the infrastructure, I guess the bottom line there is it's working pretty good. There's some gaps, there's some challenges. The speed of reporting is important, but for the most part, most of these reports are flowing in within a couple days. Now, what part of this has told us is, what's been bumpy, what hasn't worked well, and then kind of what's working. Well, I think what's working is the systems are operational, data's being collected, and part of the confusion is both being sent to the state health departments and to the CDC, and so there's a little bit of chaos and confusion out there, and so that's kind of one of those areas that make it a little bumpy. Another area that has been certainly bumpy, and I think we can all relate to this, is the scheduling components of this public health infrastructure. Public health did have scheduling tools, many of them used in the past for mass immunization events, or pharmacies had them when they went on site with employers, but they really weren't geared for high demand and high pressure situations. And so they really didn't have the kind of tools that the public demands on how to really set up appointments. And so there's created a lot of frustration out there. But really, once you're in the system and you start getting your shots, information is flowing. And now the real question is, what do you do with this data and how do you learn from it? So these scheduling systems need to be improved. Another major issue is there were a lot of independent pharmacies that weren't in the immunization business, although many of the chains were. And these folks now understand that value. And so they need to electronically connect to this infrastructure. And that takes a little time and a little investment. And so there's still 30,000 probably independent pharmacies, 20 to 30,000 that would be significant providers in this network. And by connecting them, investing in them, and helping them accelerate their immunization programs, Now you begin to build out that ecosystem to the point where almost any place anybody goes gets their shot. That data can flow to the public health and on appropriately onto CDC, and then becomes essentially situational awareness for everybody's mission. There are a few other kind of bumps that are out there, you know, but nothing that really hasn't been overcome. I think the issue is, and the pressure is that time is not on anybody's side, patience is not on anybody's side. So it's, you tend to have to react and jump through hoops that kind of take energies away. And so certainly the public health folks and the providers and really volunteers, really all of us are fairly well stressed, but frankly, the backbone, the foundation of the house at least has enough going for it that now you can begin to make better decisions on what the future should look like and where to go. And just from what I have seen so far, there are 3 or 4 areas that I think immediate investment and effort, it would be well warranted in this segment of the public health infrastructure. And one is the fact that there's so much data in these systems, and it's underutilized. 2 things need to happen. You need to have a higher quality improvement to take a look at that data. The good news is a lot of it's coming in electronically through HL7, and there's tight specs on that. So data in the last 8 to 10 years is very good. And prior to that, you know, it needs some work. And now there's new requirements for data fields like race and ethnicity that typically most of these folks haven't collected. And now, you know, you need to figure out better ways to collect that. So initiatives in those areas will all prove immediately beneficial. And then again, increasing the interoperability, not only connecting more pharmacies and providers and schools to these systems, and, you know, really the entire ecosystem, so that they can gain from the value of this data in these public health environments, and then allowing public health to take the gloves off and let folks have data. I think that interoperability is good. And it includes interoperability to other public health systems, so that when a notifiable vaccine preventable disease comes in, and they do, that it immediately connects up with this public health infrastructure, and those responsible for mitigating that impact have much more intelligence and that's behind all that. And certainly last but not least, the consumer. This pandemic has demonstrated that consumers are really the ones that need to be driving this, the next generation of all these systems, because clearly all of us want to go to the movie or their favorite restaurant or an event, and however this all shakes out. And I think Chris will talk a little bit about consumers here in a minute, but you know, it's how do we influence and empower those consumers, and it is their data. So how can they help and make the public health improvements and be participants in helping identify outbreaks or adverse reactions or post-care follow-up? And, you know, how do we really deploy that workforce to support everything we need to do? And believe me, any investment in analytics and data and creating real-time information that continues to learn and grow at every level. So a pharmacist or a provider, clinician, you know, the consumer, public health, and then roll right up to CDC and HHS or the political structure have at their fingertips, you know, immunization, in this case, immunization intelligence. So they know where to invest, where the risks are, and they help answer the tough questions and then monitor the effectiveness of the programs and policies they put in place. So I think there's a lot of good news, and we've learned a lot. And it's in a way for public health folks, they're going to look back at this. They're going to tell stories about how exciting this was. They're going to certainly be glad it's over, but they're going to be well prepared for the next one, especially if we're all smarter. And it really is these public-private partnerships across an entire ecosystem that matter. So thank you very much. Thanks, Jay.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate your insight on infrastructure and power industries. And as we get to hear Chris, and the end, just pop some of your questions into the chat. We'll try to see what we can get to. But want to transition over to Chris Moose, who is partner with Global Markets at IBM. Chris, take it away, and appreciate your insights and comments.
Oh, thanks for having me, Dr. Bhatt. And then want to build on some of the comments that other people have already made, other panelists, about the public-private partnership. My role at IBM is I'm a partner in our healthcare and life sciences practice, and I focus on how we can use technology to improve health outcomes. And Well, we have a lot of technology tools. What you've heard today is in some ways we've got a conflict between what we can do with technology and what the business models are that we have. And it's restricting the flow of information. In a lot of ways, what's going on in our fight with COVID is a challenge of information accessibility. A lot of panelists have alluded to that. So we've been focused on a couple things that we think improve that information liquidity. One of them I'll talk about briefly today is something we call Health Pass. And the second is a supply chain tool. So if we deep dive both those for just a minute or two on Health Pass, it's a technology that's based on open standards, and it strikes a balance amongst patient privacy, public health, and reopening economies. Basically, what it is the ability for someone to have a credential about their health status that they can have on their phone or they can print. Think of it like a card, a proof of an activity that something happened. And that could be a vaccination, or it could be some COVID test or something along those lines. And we're using blockchain technology, mobile applications, some hybrid cloud tools to make that possible. But it's super simple and super straightforward, because it's important that this be frictionless if we're going to get people to adopt it, and if we're going to use it as a way that we can start reopening economies and getting people back to their lives. It's also important to note that IBM isn't developing this as an IBM only technology. This is going to be an ecosystem. And so we're working with open standards on how we would go about deploying this solution, and we're working with a lot of other companies, from testing companies to other companies with a similar vision of a health passport, all of us coming together in the technology industry with the view to enabling people to get back to their lives. And if we were to take that theme of open standards and pivot it into a little bit of a different direction, away from this notion of a health credential, but to talk about more of like some of the supply chain challenges that have been making news lately, there's a second IBM solution that we're bringing to the industry. And it's really based on some of the work that we've already done in the food industry. We're basically taking information about the movement of pharmaceutical goods and allowing that information to be linked together in a novel way. And it builds on work that IBM's already done with Walmart in food safety and improving recalls around food and having better traceability so that you can trust the food that you're eating. We've piloted this with Merck as part of what the FDA asked companies to take a look at in response to the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. And this technology is something that we think is incredibly important, but again, it's something that has to be open and available to everyone. This can't be something that's IBM's. And that's why we've taken this asset and we're giving it to the Linux Foundation. And we're convening a not-for-profit consortium to help administer and run it, because we think that it's incredibly important that we come up with a fundamentally different way of engaging the industry around exchanging information. So there's a couple things that IBM's been working on. One is this notion about the ability of a consumer to have a way of representing their health status. And the second is the ability to understand supply chain information and to better address recalls, drug shortages, and tracking of critical measures, critical medicines and medical countermeasures as we fight this pandemic and ones to come. And happy to take more questions if we've got some time for Q&A here at the end of the session. With that, I'll give it back to you, Dr. Bott.
Thank you so much, Chris. Appreciate these insights on how you think about bring different components together. And so why don't I do this? I'll ask an open question here for the whole panel, and for the audience, pop your questions into the chat to Joel, and we'll get them to the panelists in query and circle back. But let me start with this question about what's one thing we have to do to accelerate the new normal and be better positioned for the future. And that might have drawn upon the technology effort you've seen or a leadership action in response to the pandemic. But I think a lot of people are thinking about how do we go forward given all that we've learned and been able to put into play, so that we're getting to opening, like you said, Chris, but also being better positioned for the future, as Dr. O'Toole had mentioned and others have mentioned on the panel. So I'll leave it open to whoever wants to take that first.
I'll take an initial pass at that one. And I want to echo some of the things that Dr. O'Toole talked about. I think it's incredibly important that we realize that we need to have a new way of dealing with biological threats, not just to the nation, but to the world. So new surveillance tools, new supply chain resiliency tools, new ways of enabling consumers to represent and understand their health status are going to be incredibly important. And just as we already have systems in place that help with some of this, I think it's important that we come up with a holistic framework into which all of our existing tools can plug into, and then make it even easier to deal with this going forward. And I would close with saying this cannot be one company's solution. This cannot be IBM's or anyone else's. It's got to be based on open standards. And as Dr. O'Toole talked about, new ways of thinking about how government and private industry come together to solve these challenges. That needs to be the lasting legacy coming out of this.
Yeah, I certainly would second that, Chris. I think we need to recognize and make sure we adequately define, based on this experience, the pandemic response ecosystem, and recognize it as an ecosystem that has interdependent parts. And then keep those parts in contact during the times between pandemics so that we can keep our tools sharp and ready for use.
Great. And another question I'll ask, and I know we're coming up here on time, and so we'll move this forward. But one of the things that I see is real opportunity to scale, and Major General Payne talked about that in some of the work that you've done. Could you talk a little bit about, what lessons could the private sector and the public sector learn from the work you've done on scale? And then Dr. O'Toole may speak about what are the characteristics of public-private partnerships that we need to ensure that we have in play to be successful.
I would say, it's one of the key lessons we've learned is that partnership that we've experienced, that I talked about, working with Health and Human Services, with the CDC, with the FDA. I think that has been probably one of the most refreshing things for me, and I think was integral to our ability to move forward, helping each other, helping each other solve problems, generating ideas, piloting and testing things, but with what was that going to work? So I think that's been one of the things for me, that the partnerships we built over the past year, we in the past perhaps have operated more in silos. We always had interagency cooperation, but it was never as real time as it's been over the past 11 months for me.
Great, thank you.
So on partnerships, I would start by saying that you don't create them overnight. You can create a partnership in the midst of a terrible crisis, enduring trench warfare. But the better way to create enduring partnerships is to have ongoing conversations and collaborations. So I would say that both the public and the private sector need to have a lot more interaction in the days to come. I would like to see Congress, which is going to be very busy dealing with COVID and other matters important to the nation, have a lot more hearings on what is happening in the private sector with respect to biotech innovation, what really is the current picture of the possible, which I think will surprise Congress with its promise. I also think we need to recognize that not everything that is necessary to innovation in technologies important to national security is going to come out of DoD. And we have to figure out how to encourage that innovation, and that involves everything from building talent pipelines that can prosper in both the public and private sectors, to the translational infrastructure I was talking about. I think we have to realize we are at an inflection point in technological innovation in this country. And we have an opportunity to take past investments and move them forward. But we have to grab that opportunity. It's not going to happen automatically based upon past practices and institutions.
Thank you so much, Dr. O'Toole. And I think we'll have this one question from the audience about a really important issue that I think has come up in a lot of innovation work and data and infrastructure work is what role does the patient's privacy protection in general and personal health information in particular play in the fight with COVID-19, especially when data is used to build the AI solutions. And so you think about exposure notification, you think about all the other things that have come forth, registries and so forth. So that's an open response for any of you that want to weigh in.
Hey, Jay, I'll take a quick crack at that just from the immunization side, but I want to make one other quick comment about partnerships, public-private, that I've seen. Ones that seem to me that work is when the members of the partnership have each other's back. And sometimes one has to take the lead and then the next time the other, but if they produce measurable outcomes in a timely fashion, so it doesn't go on and they're agile, members can come and go, but they're all contributing. So I think that's one of the big lessons here in the pandemic, because those kind of partnerships are really helping make a difference. In terms of ownership of data and, and vaccine data and for consumers, clearly it's their data. But they need to be able to consent that whatever appropriate portion of that information can be used. And so I think, again, the consent and how we monitor and track that and allow them to be in or out and those sort of things is still something we all have to pay very much attention to, even though, we may just provide, for a vaccine, we may just be essentially giving somebody a thumbs up. They've got both doses and no other pieces of information. You have to assume that still that's critical. And so having systems that monitor and track that, it's a big deal.
Got it. Great. And Jim, were you going to jump in here or not?
Well, I just wanted to offer that there's a microcosm of that question in the clinical trial system that we deal with frequently. And there's several 100,000 people walking around the planet now that are clinical trial participants in the vaccine trials. And it's very much on the front end and back end, as Mike described. It's incredibly important to respect and acknowledge the importance of privacy rules and responsibilities on the front end with proper information and informed consent, and on the back end with exchange of data, making sure that any data that's shared or exchanged or used outside of the context of the trial is done so in an appropriately anonymized and de-identified manner.
Great. Thanks so much. And I think we'll see if there's any other comments, but Chris, I wanted to see if you had a perspective on this issue, given the spaces you're in, about how the industry could think about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we agree with some of the prior comments about it's important that the patient be in control of their data, that they have consents that make sense, that they can process. It's not just some click through that they're going through. But I would suggest we move it up a little bit. Some of the things that IBM is building in our digital health pass is intentionally architected to allow the patient to control their information. The very premise of have I been vaccinated for COVID or not is a decision that the patient should have the ability to decide, am I going to let someone know that or not as I go into a venue, to use the analogy of a passport going into a venue or something. I think also it's important that there's a lot of legal and regulatory framework that we can comply with, but we still lose the trust of the public, and that would be a tragedy. So what we've got to keep in mind is we need to be compliant with legal, we need to do the right thing, but we also have to figure out how do we do things and share enough transparency on how this data is being used that people adopt the tools that we're rolling out. Because if we give society at large the ability to do this with your health information, but no one trusts that it's being used in an ethical manner, then they won't adopt the tools. And then we're just right back where we are today. So that notion of transparency, trust is a higher bar that we need to be striving to, not just HIPAA and GDPR and some of the buzzwords we have right now.
Great, thanks, Chris. And I'm just very full with rich expertise here and information and insight. I think you all did a wonderful job. And now I certainly go to my patients with even more trust about vaccinations and about the path forward, and certainly in my public health capacity here. So really appreciate all of you for your comments, your service, your leadership. And when I think about leadership, I think about the definition of it is accepting responsibility for enabling shared purpose in the face of uncertainty. And you all have demonstrated that in spades. So thank you for all that you've done. And with that, I'll bring it back to Joel to close us out here. Thanks so much, and appreciate everyone that attended. And I just want to join me in a virtual applause for our panel as well.
Yeah, seriously, I had high expectations for this panel, and you guys didn't disappoint. So wanted to thank you all for being here. It strikes me a few takeaways, and Dr. Bott, obviously, great job, and looking forward to working with everyone here in the future. But, you know, what I'm hearing is we really need to build on what works and invest, you know, for the long term. I think that, you know, that investment that we're seeing out of Congress, you know, Mike, your point, Dr. O'Toole, your point about, you know, we saw this coming, right? Like we had the Pandemic All Hazard Response Act in 2006, and, you know, we were anticipating a lot of this, but we didn't necessarily invest in smart ways. And we are investing a lot of money right now in the infrastructure. And I think, Dr. Main, what we heard from you is that investment in the partnerships and the relationships also was foundational to getting the innovation out the door, and now shots in the arms. And Mike, what you've done with the immunization registries, and Major General Payne, what you were able to do on the testing and logistical side. It just strikes me that we've got to have a plan around this. If we don't have a plan, if CDC doesn't have some kind of a roadmap to modernization that's not, you know, kind of bird dogged by a general, probably at the White House. I mean, a general in the general sense, not in the major general sense. That you know, you've got to have a quarterback here, and the quarterback's got to have a clear vision for where we need to go. And you can iterate, and you can make mistakes, and you can pivot and do all those things, but we ought to have a plan. And it seems like really with this money flowing through the door, the CDC modernization effort needs some structure around it. And then I think finally, the creating a demand signal. The market is very good at responding to demand signals. And Chris, your points were very well taken. And I think those tools will evolve and be built, but we need to make sure that they're built on a foundation of good data, accurate data, reliable data, and trust, to your point about consumers. So what I think HIA is going to do going forward is really catalog all the different rules and things that were barriers that were put aside during the pandemic and incentives that were put on the table, and kind of pass through our advisory board and other experts within our coalition to say, we shouldn't go back. Let's make sure that we can retain these flexibilities going forward so that we can continue to promote innovation in dealing with pandemics and other serious challenges. Those are my takeaways. I want to thank our panel and commit to working with everyone here going forward. And just thank you so much for your time and your effort. And thanks everyone in the audience for participating today.